Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, February 11th, 2016. The Nefarium's been busy. If you've been watching Europe, Chancellor Angela Merkel is whining and complaining about Russia and its intervention in Syria and so on and so forth. China is complaining about American naval activity close to its claimed islands in the South Sea, but this week there's an interesting story, and there's a lot of different ways to interpret it. This is a story that we've been hearing out of Europe for some time. This is reported by RT. Germany and France are calling for a joint Eurozone finance ministry. Now, I really have to kind of laugh at the whole idea of the European Union. We've been watching it fall apart at the seams, really, with the austerity policies with Greece and Syriza a couple years ago. I can never pronounce that correctly. And we've been watching it fall apart with the refugee crisis, governments bringing in refugees who are treated better oftentimes than their own native populations. We've been watching, in other words, I think, the collapse of a kind of forced government sponsored multiculturalism policy. They do not like it in Sweden. You cannot blame them. They do not like it in the Netherlands. They do not like it in Germany. And it's spreading to Belgium, and more recently, we've seen it spread to France. So, in the midst of all this, we also have, of course, the rumblings in Great Britain that continue to press for Great Britain to pull out of the euro, pull out of the Eurozone, pull out of the European Union. I think that would actually personally be a good thing if Britain pulled out of the European Union. Britain really doesn't have anything to gain. Britain's financial status, it's still a very major player on the global financial markets. It's the leader of the British Commonwealth. It has a lot of stuff going for it, and I really don't think it needs Europe. But now, of course, we've got Germany and France calling for a joint Eurozone finance ministry, and this really goes back all the way to the founding of the EU, the dreams of Jean-Claude Monnet, and so on, way back in the 1950s, ultimately seeing a European federated state with its own federal government type of superstructure and, of course, its own finance ministry. The more recent calls for this have been, of course, from Jean-Claude Trichet. So let's look at this very briefly. This is an RT story. Quote, the Eurozone needs structural reform and closer financial integration. In other words, forget about national sovereignty, folks. It's now all going to be done at Brussels. And of course, guess what? It's Paris and Berlin calling for us for this. We don't see much of this sort of call being echoed from Rome or Madrid or any of the other capitals in Europe. So here we go. Including the creation of a joint finance ministry, RT is saying, and this is being touted by, quote, the heads of the German and French central banks. So now, in a guest article for the German daily Süddeutsche Zeitung, they wrote that the current state of the Eurozone was far from ideal, and European Union integration is at a crossroads. The European Central Bank is not in a position to create sustainable long-term growth for the 19-nation single currency bloc, according to the bank's chiefs. Although monetary policy has done a lot for the Eurozone economy, it can't create sustainable economic growth, said Bundesbank President Jens Weidmann and the Bank of France chief François Villeroy de Gallou, I believe it is. According to them, the creation of a common finance ministry with an independent fiscal council and the formation of a stronger political body could help overcome the European debt crisis. In other words, what they really want to do is get their hands on the financial sovereignty and financial policy of the southern European nations, particularly Spain, Portugal, and the big one, of course, being Italy. So this is what's going on. And I really want to caution you folks in Europe. I think you need to go the other direction. Now, there is a possibility here that we have to look at as to what a long-term geopolitical goal here might be, other than Paris and Berlin consolidating their already enormous influence in the European Union. And that is, as you've probably recalled, over the last year, we've seen the European Union attempting to buck some of the policy dictates coming from Washington. We have to remember the other big backer of European Union has always been Washington. And the reason why is it's much easier for Washington to control and influence a central state than it is several smaller states, some of them very powerful. So I had someone point out to me that maybe this is a power play so that they can consolidate their financial and economic clout and influence and be a counterpose to Washington. And that indeed has always been the argument as far as the Europeans are concerned for the European Union. But in this case, I don't think that this is true. I think this is a desperation measure at this point to save the European Union and to create, as the article really says, the goal here isn't simply a European wide finance ministry. The goal here is to create a political body. All right. Currently, the European Union is being run by a bunch of bureaucrats in Brussels. It's not really a democratic institution at all. You have bureaucrats dictating policies, and they're dictating policies via regulation, as much as what we see going on in the United States. When the presidency cannot get anything done with Congress, it just issues executive orders, and more often than not, these are simply unchallenged. So you have effectively dictatorship by oligarchy going on in both places. What this really means is, I think, is what they're trying to do, and there's a story in the background here, folks, and that's what's been happening with the refugee crisis. When they say they want to create a political body, what I believe they're attempting to do is they're attempting to short circuit the process that we've seen going on now for the past few months in Europe, where you have now populist, if you want to call them that, populist parties of revolt against the multiculturalist policies that have been foisted on the vast majority of the voting population in Europe by their governments. This is true in Great Britain, where you've seen a massive increase of refugees, where British cities no longer even look or feel British, where you've seen more recently the New Year's demonstrations and rapes in Cologne, Germany, more recently the victimization, sexual molestation, quite frankly, of a young boy in Vienna, Austria, where you've seen the same thing happen in Sweden on a massive, massive scale. You've seen the same thing happen in Brussels. You've seen it in France. You've seen it in Spain. And also, of course, Italy. And this is producing a popular backlash against the centralized policies being run out of Brussels and behind the scenes by Berlin. It's really been Angela Merkel's government that has been driving this refugee crisis, and it is smashing what unity there is in the European Union. I think this is the backlash from the central state, the central government in Brussels. It's a small stepping stone on a way that you don't want to go. So it's more centralized control that they're after. It's more centralized control over the sovereign finances of each European nation. This is the common market run amok and run bad. I think ultimately, folks, this is going to fail unless they rethink their entire domestic policy, unless they rethink their entire refugee policy in a very dramatic fashion. Otherwise, I think these parties are going to lose power ultimately and over time. Europe cannot be culturally divided. This is the bottom line. And it's being culturally divided, and the basic institutions and values of our Western culture are now under assault. And Paris and Berlin so far have shown very little resolve in trying to stand up to this. I think you're going to see in the coming years, and particularly this year, this is an important story to watch, because I think you're going to see Europe try to address this refugee problem behind fake stories and fake solutions like this. Uh, I think you're going to see some of these popular parties reaching out to the Russians And the reason why I think you're going to see them reaching out to the Russians is that, if you recall, the Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Sergei Glazov, or pardon me, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, have made it very clear that they want a genuine international coalition against terrorism, and Russia has been calling for this. I think you're going to see what we've seen happen recently with the president of the Christian Democratic Party in the German state of Bavaria taking the initiative to go visit President Putin individually. And certainly this was not with the support or blessing of the CDU party leader, which is, of course, Chancellor Merkel. I think you're going to see this from France. I think you're going to see this from Belgium. I think you're going to see it from the Netherlands, from Sweden, and everywhere in Europe where you have an increasing refugee crisis at the same time as you have an increasing financial crisis. This is going to bubble over. I think the central government in Brussels has to get its act together and start being much more responsive, or the whole thing's going to fall apart, folks. So that's it for my news and views. A story to watch very, very closely.